Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, I'm Amber Duke, joined by Niall Stanage. Niall, what's in your notebook this morning?
Well, thank you for asking, Amber. The ghost of Ronald Reagan came back to haunt Donald Trump this week. On Thursday, a judge appointed by Reagan blocked Trump on a key executive order. The order was Trump's effort to dismantle birthright citizenship, the broad rule that anyone born in this nation is a citizen. And yes, there are exceptions, but they're exceptionally narrow. Children born to foreign diplomats, for example. Now, you can agree or disagree with the idea of birthright citizenship, but it's in the Constitution, clear as day. Trump, to be fair, has said for a while that he's going to try to end birthright citizenship, so his opponents were ready when he released the order. It has been met with at least 6 lawsuits already, and the plaintiffs include 22 states. The first judge to rule on the challenges was John Coffenauer, who I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. In any event, he's a US district judge in the Western District of Washington, and he was named to the bench in 1981. The judge drew on his long experience to tell Trump's team that they were talking nonsense. Quote, "I've been on the bench for over 4 decades, Coffenauer said. I can't remember another case where the question presented was as clear as this one. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order." Coffenauer even went so far as to ask the attorney representing Trump's Justice Department whether he really believed what he was saying. Quote, "Frankly, I have difficulty understanding how a member of the bar could state unequivocally that this is a constitutional order. It just boggles my mind," the perplexed judge said. So for now, Trump's big executive order is paused, and that's a good thing. The relevant part of the 14th Amendment says this: "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." All persons, not some and not such persons as Donald Trump deems appropriate. Trump supporters have argued that the clause about jurisdiction opens the way for broad restrictions. They are welcome to argue that if they want, but it isn't what the courts have held so far. Is a person who is in the United States without authorization exempt from the jurisdiction of the United States? Obviously not. Try arguing that if the ICE agents arrive at the door and you say that you're not eligible or don't come under the jurisdiction of the US. So the breaking of one law does not render a person immune from all laws. And it's rather bizarre that Trump and other conservatives would be arguing that it does. Similar arguments have been rebuffed repeatedly over the years, whether in courts or on Capitol Hill. In 1995, Assistant Attorney General Walter Dellinger testified to Congress on the matter. Quote, "There can be no question that children born in the United States of aliens are subject to the full jurisdiction of the United States," he said. The Supreme Court ruled on the question more than a century ago, and this was a case we discussed briefly on yesterday's Rising. The case was United States versus Wong Kim Ark, and it was decided in 1898. In summary, Wong was a 21-year-old who had been born in San Francisco to Chinese parents. At the time, there were restrictionist laws around Chinese immigration in particular. Wong's parents not only were non-citizens, but they were going to stay that way. They had no path to citizenship, you might say. Wong left the US for a visit and was barred from coming back in. Authorities argued he was not a citizen. He said he was, and he took his case to the Supreme Court. He won. The justices ruled in his favour 6-2. But here's the key point. Justice Horace Gray for the majority said plainly that the 14th Amendment, quote, "affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory." Gray also said that every citizen or subject of another country, while domiciled here, is within the allegiance and the protection and consequently subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Finally, Gray noted that the basic purpose of the 14th Amendment was not to restrict or caveat citizenship, but to be clear about its expansiveness. The amendment, quote, "is declaratory in form and enabling and extending in effect," he said. So you'll notice there's one thing I haven't said, which is whether I believe the actual doctrine of birthright citizenship is right or wrong. And that's because that's irrelevant. It's in the Constitution, and it has been upheld by the courts, regardless of what I think, or of what Donald Trump thinks for that matter. Trump did get one thing sort of right on this question, and that happened last month. Appearing on Meet the Press, Trump was asked by Kristen Welker whether his desire to end birthright citizenship could, quote, get around the 14th Amendment. Let's watch.
You promised to end birthright citizenship on day one. Is that still your plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
The 14th Amendment, though, says that, quote, all persons born in the United States are citizens. Can you get around the 14th Amendment with an executive action?
We're going to have to get a change. We'll maybe have to go back to the people, but we have to end it.
That part is right, Mr. President. There is a remedy for the problem that you believe you've identified. And that remedy is changing the Constitution. And good luck with that. But it's a lot more cumbersome than sending out a piece of paper. But on the other hand, if it worked, at least it wouldn't be blatantly unconstitutional, as Reagan's judge rightly told you about your executive order this week. So, we're going to have a disagreement about this, I think,
I
Amber.
suspect so.
But, I mean, I've laid out my position there, so you go for it. Tell me why you think I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was briefed on this earlier this week by some pretty smart attorneys, and their contention is that they have the correct interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which is supported by the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which states that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. So they contend that in the jurisdiction thereof is not solely people who are subject to American laws, which is why foreign diplomats would be excluded from birthright citizenship because they typically have diplomatic immunity. But they also cannot be subject to having allegiances or under the jurisdiction of another foreign power. And that's where you have people who are either on temporary visas, green cards, or illegal aliens being exempt from that statute. It would not include, however, legal permanent residents, which if I remember correctly in U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, his parents were permanent legal residents. They just couldn't get citizenship because of the ban at that time on Chinese nationals becoming U.S. citizens.
That is true that I think that at the time the question of legal versus illegal immigrants and who was a legal permanent resident, I'm not sure that the green card system had actually even been devised at that point. But the argument I think there is that when the Supreme Court decided that in that case, the question was not the immigration status of the parents. It was whether you are domiciled in the United States. And people who are very opposed to illegal or unauthorized immigration accept that those people are domiciled in the United States. That's the whole point, that they want them out, right? People who are living there. So the argument here is, are you living in the United States and do you fall under one of these very narrow restrictions? And for the vast majority of people, they do not fall under those narrow restrictions. They were born here. The Constitution gives them the right to citizenship. There are other countries that have changed similar laws in their case, which they're of course entitled to do. I made the point in the notes that I'm not getting the question of what I believe, but the merits of the underlying idea isn't here or there. I think that the Constitution is very clear. I think that's why the Reagan-appointed judge rebuffed the executive order so strongly. And I think it will be an enormously uphill climb to, I'm sure the attorneys who briefed you are very smart, but I think they have a great difficulty in making that case.
Maybe so. They definitely intend on taking it to the Supreme Court, according to an anonymous DOJ official. They said that they expect to go to the Supreme Court. They're fairly confident about their chances of winning. Of course, they would say that, though. But what they did note that I thought was interesting was that there are numerous justices on that court who have never weighed in publicly on the issue of birthright citizenship, including Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, and even Chief Justice John Roberts. So it's sort of a roll of the dice to an extent as to what way those conservative justices would ultimately lean on this argument. But I think that they would obviously contend that that previous Supreme Court case, Wong Kim Ark, was wrongly decided in the sense that the Trump administration's EO does allow legal permanent residents, the children of those individuals, to get birthright citizenship. So they feel like that question on the court case was correct, but the underlying sort of premise from the judge that means that the domicile is what matters was incorrect.
But I mean, you would accept, would you not, that people who are here without authorization are still subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Like that's
well, it depends on what you mean what you think that clause means. Do you think that it means that you have to follow the law while you're in the U.S.? Because that would apply to an invading army, for example, but we wouldn't say that an invading army's children should become American citizens.
But an invading army's children are already invalidated under the laws that we have. That would not be changing the law to make that provision. That provision is already in there by virtue of the previous Supreme Court ruling that we're talking about, albeit from 1898.
Yeah, I think that the jurisdictional question, again, is supported by this 1866 Civil Rights Act, where it is explicitly defined by Congress as not being subject to another foreign power.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we will agree to disagree, but I think it has been a good discussion of constitutional law to get Rising underway today. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising. Stick with us.
Egg prices are expected to soar, all because of a flu that's causing birds to descend.
USDA data shows that avian influenza has killed almost 13 million birds within the last 30 days.
Sorry, but I don't think that read was right. Causing birds to descend?
I think it's a word.
Play on words.
But I think the word play is the figures are soaring while the birds are falling from avian flu.
Okay.
Am I correct that that's supposed to be a bit of wordplay there?
Yeah, I think you're right. It just didn't work for me, I guess.
That's fine. I
Yeah.
mean, it's. Do you want to say something else?
Yeah, I'll just.
Okay.
Sorry, can we run it again? Egg prices are expected to soar, and that's all because of a flu that's causing birds to descend.
USDA data shows that avian influenza has killed almost 13 million birds within the last 30 days.
This bird flu made its way to the U.S. in 2022, and according to USDA data, the virus has so far infected or killed around 136 million birds thus far.
Here's MSNBC's Chris Hayes last night.
Donald Trump never learned that lesson. And look, he won the election anyway because voters wanted lower egg prices. So it's a particularly ironic twist that one of the main consequences of this ongoing bird flu outbreak so far has been killing lots of chickens and creating a massive egg shortage and skyrocketing egg prices. Maybe people will pay attention to that.
Michigan economics professor Justin Wolfers wrote on X, "The folks obsessively posting about egg prices for the past few years have gone strangely quiet just as egg prices hit an all-time high."
Publisher of the dossier, Jordan Schachtel, wrote, 1. The Biden admin ran a massive bird flu scam, which led to bad economic conditions for people who supply the eggs, and it forced the prices to skyrocket. 2. Trump has been in office for 3 days. Take a moment to digest this reality, economist professor.
Democratic TikToker Harry Sisson wrote, "Trump has been president for 3 days and egg prices are at all-time highs. Trump's America, haha."
Internet personality and Billboard charting artist Chandler Crump wrote, "If you asked a liberal about the economy 2 weeks ago, they'd say, Bidenomics is working. Everything is great. Trump is president now, and suddenly eggs are too expensive. Gas is too expensive. Funny how that works."
So I think what this mainly illustrates is how juvenile a lot of political debates have become. I mean, there are things that are outside of the control of whoever happens to be president of the United States at that time. And we see that in much, much bigger ways. And I was just scratching out some notes just before we did this segment about the presidents who've been affected by economic booms or busts that it's highly questionable they were really responsible for. Bill Clinton benefited from the tech boom in the 1990s. Before him, H.W. Bush was afflicted by a recession toward the end of his term. Neither of those men were necessarily, responsible for either the boom or the bust in that case. Now, perhaps you know more about who is culpable for the outbreak of avian flu than I do, but I just assume that this is a thing that has occurred that has killed lots of chickens, which is very sad, but has forced the price of eggs up. I'm not sure that it is either something for which Biden or Trump are really responsible.
No, I mean, so one of the conspiracies, quote unquote, that's been floating around is that Joe Biden, or his administration rather, was being overly cautious with the culling of flocks, whether bird flu had infected the flock or just a nearby area. They were killing hundreds of millions of birds. So most of the bird flu deaths of birds in the U.S. have been due to intentional culling of flocks as opposed to these birds getting it and dying, which is interesting. But here's where the conspiracy comes in.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm trying to figure out what his motivation would be, but please proceed.
Joe Biden gave $590 million to a pharmaceutical company for development of an mRNA bird flu vaccine, and I want to say it was Pfizer, but don't quote me on that. Okay. But the CEO of that company was seen giving interviews talking about how we have to vaccinate every single bird in the United States for bird flu. So, you see the conspiracy, right? Joe Biden intentionally causing a panic about bird flu and killing millions of birds so that he can justify giving this massive grant to Big Pharma to vaccinate the birds.
I can't believe we now have like bird flu truthers who are arguing about that it's all a massive conspiracy. I mean, some of these things I just shake my head about. The broader issue of the economy is obviously one where inflation did hurt Biden very, very badly when it peaked in June 22, I think.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and it was then above 9%. It was the highest inflation rate since the early 1980s. That clearly inflicted a political wound on him that he never really recovered from. Now, the Biden people would certainly argue that they should deserve some credit for inflation having fallen again quite precipitously, and it is now at more normal levels. They obviously didn't get any credit from the voters for that.
Nor should they.
I think, well, that's a whole other, I mean,
I know.
We'll get into that other debate. But in relation to, I mean, Trump has suggested that he himself will now be able to tame inflation. We'll see how he gets along with that. Certainly the tariffs idea is one that I think most economists consider inflationary, but we don't yet know how far he's going to push through with that.
Yeah, I mean, the tariff question is one that is sort of dependent on how other countries respond, right? Because in some instances, the tariffs are being used to negotiate assistance on border policy. In other instances, like with China, it's to try to get China to actually have fair trade with the United States. They exercise all kinds of tariffs on American goods, but we don't give them the same level of tariffs in return. So it's more about fair and reciprocal trade than it is free trade. So there's a lot of elements to the tariff policy where it's not a broad same policy across the board, which obviously impacts how much prices would actually increase. Then there's the question of, are you putting tariffs on component parts of products, or are you putting it on the final good? Typically it's the component parts, which means the overall price increase is slightly smaller than it would be on the final product. But then also when you're coupling tariffs with a policy of both tax cuts for American incomes, as well as his other big economic policy, which is somehow just escaped my brain.
That happens sometimes, happens to us all. You'll be like Rick Perry trying to remember
exactly the three government agencies he wants to cut.
Trying to go. Well, let me just address
jump in.
The negotiating point, and maybe the other point will come back to you.
I hope so.
In relation to the tariffs, I hear a lot of people say, well, this is a negotiating position. It is trying to force or prod other countries to change their policy in ways that Trump wants. Now, that could be the case, that he is using it as a negotiating tactic. But in general, in negotiations, a threat only works if the opposing party thinks that there is a real chance of that threat being followed through upon. And I think the danger here on the tariffs question is, if the threat was followed through upon in terms of, say, a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports, or a 10 to 15% tariff globally, the danger is, and I think that a widespread belief is, that that would hurt the United States economy and American consumers so much that Trump is actually, in fact, highly unlikely to follow through at that level.
Well, I believe the foreign leaders do believe he's likely to follow through. Otherwise, Trudeau wouldn't have flown down to Mar-a-Lago almost immediately after the threat was made to try to negotiate with Trump, and then he ultimately resigned from his party because of criticism that he got for trying to negotiate. And Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico.
But hold on, he got into trouble with his party because he was being seen as too quiescent with Trump. So other people obviously don't believe it's serious or believe that.
Yeah, the idiot liberals in his party who are about to lose power because they've mismanaged Canada into the ground. around. But,
yeah, but
at the same time, Claudia Sheinbaum
threats. But anyway,
at the same time, Claudia Sheinbaum initially talked a big game about how Mexico wasn't going to play ball, and she's since changed her tune as well and has met with several members of the incoming Trump administration. So obviously, both of these people don't think that Trump is just bluffing. And then the other part of the economy that I was going to get into earlier in regards to tariffs was that when you couple tariffs with a robust domestic energy policy, you're going to see those prices level out, because energy policy, when you produce natural gas, oil, et cetera, at home, you're reducing not just the cost of energy, but also you have knock-on effects in other industries, specifically relating to food prices, whether it's transportation, whether it's manufacturing, packaging, processing. All of these other industries are going to benefit from energy prices being lower, being produced in the U.S. So I think you would see, because you have both of these things happening concurrently, the tariffs and the energy policy, that if there were a price increase, it would be very negligible.
Well, I think that is a more substantive discussion than asking who's responsible for the high price of eggs as a result of avian flu. Up next, President Trump speaks truth to power, or does he? More on Rising coming up soon.
America is back and open for business. That is the message from President Donald Trump to the global elite at their annual playground in Davos, Switzerland. Let's watch.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
President Trump beamed into the annual meeting Thursday to lay out some of his economic vision. He also called out the CEO of Bank of America for allegedly not doing business with conservatives. Let's watch that.
And by the way, speaking of you, and you've done a fantastic job, but I hope you start opening your bank to conservatives, because many conservatives complain that the banks are not allowing them to do business within the bank, and that included a place called Bank of America. They don't take conservative business. And I don't know if the regulators mandated that because of Biden or what, but you and Jamie and everybody, I hope you're going to open your banks to conservatives, because what you're doing is wrong.
In his parting remarks, Trump said this about the Paris Climate Agreement.
I terminated the ridiculous and incredibly wasteful Green New Deal. I call it the Green New Scam. Withdrew from the one-sided Paris Climate Accord and ended the insane and costly electric vehicle mandate. We're going to let people buy the car they want to buy. I declared a national energy emergency, and that's so important, national energy emergency, to unlock the liquid gold under our feet and pave the way for rapid approvals of new energy infrastructure.
So I think that Trump has the kernel of a point here, which he is exaggerating as he is prone to do. I don't know if you read this the same way I did, but I assume what he's referring to is the tendency of banks to have these so-called ESG policies, which sometimes they decide to not do things because they do or do not align with their values. And at one time, Bank of America, who he was targeting there, said that they were not going to finance the businesses of gun manufacturers who manufactured assault-style weapons other than for law enforcement or for the military. And they said they weren't going to do that, and then they subsequently backed away from that to some extent, more recently saying that they would look at things on a case-by-case basis. I think there are very legitimate questions about that, because I was thinking around this point, and I don't want to blabber on for ages here, but I think that there is a problem with liberals arguing against the Bank of America position here, because liberals typically argue that if you're hanging out your shingle in the public sphere, you can't then you can't refuse people's service based upon your views. And we've seen that happen on the left, that the argument being made about, say, gay marriage or same-sex marriage, and bakers making cakes and all that. The liberals say, no, you can't do that. You can't discriminate on the basis of the view being expressed. So that is one thing. Where he gets the idea that they won't, what was the quote? They won't take, Bank of America won't take conservative business. That seems a very exaggerated claim, if indeed what he's talking about is the gun manufacturer stuff.
Yeah, so the gun manufacturers is definitely part of the criticism of Bank of America, but there actually are a lot of examples of individual conservatives specifically being told that they're no longer allowed to bank there, with getting their accounts frozen and in some cases not being able to access their money anymore. So a few examples of this would be Eric Prince, of course, the founder of Blackwater Private Security, MMA fighter Tara LaRosa, John Eastman, who was one of the lawyers for Trump during the 2020 election fraud cases. And look, I'll throw it out, Nick Fuentes. I don't like the guy. I don't much agree with anything that he says. But the idea that he shouldn't be able to have a bank account because he expresses views that some find repugnant, I think is completely wrong. Nigel Farage has been debanked in the UK. And Melania and Barron Trump. Melania said in her recent memoir she wouldn't name the bank, but she said they both had their accounts closed by a bank too. And they often hide under the idea that these people are bringing some kind of risk to the bank. They'll say, well, if we suspect someone of money laundering, for example, or using the money for something illegal, then we will remove them from our platform to protect ourselves from potential criminal liability or from PR damage. But they never provide any evidence that any of these people are engaged or even suspected of being engaged in any of those activities. And they often don't tell these people why their accounts were removed.
Well, I mean, Bank of America completely pushes back on the idea that it punishes people for their political views. Now, in some of these cases, these are clearly people who have been, of one kind or another, under criminal investigation, correct? I mean, John Eastman was certainly charged, was he not?
Tara LaRosa wasn't.
I'm not sure. I don't know anything about her.
Yeah, she's just an MMA fighter who puts conservative tweets on.
I mean, Bank of America say that they have an enormous number of accounts in the hundreds of thousands of faith-based organizations of all kinds, and that there is no suggestion, because what would the actual motivation be on the part of a bank to say to someone who is conservative or liberal, purely on the basis of your views, we're not banking?
According to Mark Andreessen, he talked about this on Joe Rogan podcast recently, that they have evidence that the government has threatened regulation on banks who don't remove certain accounts from their platforms.
But that is to say, I mean, to say that is true, that I'm sure the government does indeed say certain accounts, but those certain accounts, to get back to your original point, are accounts where it is claimed that there is some suggestion of money laundering.
That's the cover that they give.
Well, is it? I mean,
Yeah.
we don't actually know that that's the cover, other than, well, we don't know it's not a legitimate concern. You're assuming that the conservative case is just correct because they say so, which I don't think we should
I think
assume.
it's incumbent on the bank to provide evidence that they are suspected of that, though. If you're going to remove someone's money from them, take their money away, then the burden of proof is on the bank.
Well, you're not taking their money away. You're taking the capacity to deposit their money.
Well, not
with
necessarily.
them
In some cases, these people weren't able to access their money for months until they were finally sent a check in the mail. That entire time, they're not getting interest.
That's not true. I'm not sure.
What?
That the people weren't able to access their bank.
For multiple months until they got a check in the mail. They were not told when they were going to get their money. In the meantime, they don't have access to it. They can't get interest on it. I mean...
But I still don't see where are you getting that from, for example, the suggestion that they can't access their money?
They've said it themselves, these people who have been debanked.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and it's not an uncommon practice. I mean, look at what happened in Canada to the Freedom Convoy, right? They were offered millions of dollars in donations to GoFundMe from people throughout the United States and Canada, and that money was seized by the Canadian government. I don't think it's beyond the pale to suggest that similar things could be happening in the United States.
But, well, I just think that there is a very separate point between the ESG policies, which I think are hard to defend because they are biasing the provision of public service on the basis of someone's activities, and unverified allegations that people have been targeted whenever the bank adamantly denies that, and there is no conceivable, plausible motivation for the bank to deny swathes of conservatives or swathes of people with any other political
If I may
opinions
just
about
point out one more additional piece of evidence, which is that multiple states' attorneys general sent letters to Bank of America and other banking groups last year over the canceling of accounts of Christian ministry groups. So Bank of America says, oh no, we have tons of faith-based groups on our platform.
Bank of America says that one of those groups was one which, without saying anything about it or giving any advance notice, branched out from its Christian work to do debt collection agency work, which Bank of America said was not covered.
Well,
was not
one
part
of which,
the
but they
agreement.
canceled multiple accounts, and I don't.
Well, I can't go through all of them off the top of my head. I'm just
Right.
saying to you that the claim that they blanketly cancelled faith-based groups is one that they adamantly deny and have provided evidence as to why that is not the case in at least one of the cases.
Well, I don't think it has to be a blanket case that they've denied all faith-based groups. As long as several of them are getting caught in a dragnet, then that's suggestive of a biased policy that inappropriately
Not
flags
necessarily.
conservative-leaning groups or individuals more than left-leaning groups.
We don't know, though. If it's isolated cases, we don't know that it hasn't happened to people of different political persuasion.
Well, I would also point out to you that FinCEN and the FBI had also facilitated back-channel discussions, this is according to a report from the House Judiciary Committee, with banks, telling them to flag certain transactions because these people could potentially be engaged in illegal conduct. And these transactions included keywords such as MAGA, Trump, purchases of Bibles and other religious texts, firearms-related items, and even shopping at Cabela's or Dick's Sporting
Yeah,
Goods.
it also included, I believe, pornography, pawn shops, and various other things that have no ostensible ideological purpose. We have been told to wrap. That was a spirited discussion. Up next, President Trump says he will release all classified files about the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy.
It's a haunting question that for many has never been sufficiently answered. What really happened to President John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr.?
We all know that the three men were assassinated. The then president was killed in 1963, King, the civil rights icon, in April 1968, and RFK, then a presidential candidate, just a couple of months later. Since then, many of the documents that were previously classified have been released, and that hasn't stopped theories from being bandied about as to who was behind the killings. Some have suggested dirty tricks or the covert involvement of the intelligence agencies.
President Trump signed an executive order Thursday that demands the release of thousands more classified government documents related to the three assassinations. Let's watch.
We will also reverse the overclassification of government documents, and in the coming days, we are going to make public remaining records relating to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other topics of great public interest. It's all going to be released, Uncle Sam.
President Trump's son, Don Jr., posted, quote, JFK, RFK, and MLK Jr. files released, more promises made and kept. The Young Turks, I can never know how to pronounce his name, but that guy, wrote, quote, do you want to do that again then? Cenk Uygur. Okay. Will we go again then? Okay. The Young Turks' Cenk Uygur wrote, quote, Trump ordering the release of government files on JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations is a great thing. I don't know how much of the real evidence is in there, but I'll take it. And I'd like to remind my friends on the left, releasing the files was originally a left-wing position.
Political analyst and professor of poli-sci at UVA, Larry Sabato, posted, quote, Americans have waited 61 plus years through 11 presidents for the full release of secret JFK docs. At last, we're still waiting. The odds that all files will be out in 15 days or 45 days are not high, especially if left to government agencies that have buried accountability for decades. So that's the difficult part here, Niall. We still have to wait. This is not an immediate release, up to 45 days for a lot of these files. And I think, for people who do have suspicion about government involvement in these assassinations, one of the issues is, did the people involved already destroy or conceal a lot of the documentation that would have shown their involvement? I'm really worried that this is not going to be the bombshell that so many are hoping for.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. There have been an enormous number of documents already released. There is a comparatively modest number still awaiting release. I think they should be released, to be perfectly clear, and I think it's a good thing that Trump is releasing them. I think that most people who have studied particularly the JFK assassination, which is perhaps, well, has certainly bred the most theories, I would say, of all of those three terrible assassinations, there does not seem a real expectation that there will be some bombshell discovery. Now, the Kennedy assassination, the John F. Kennedy assassination, is one of those ones that, to say it is a conspiracy theory to not believe the government is not really accurate. It's one of the few things in American history where opinion polls have never shown people believing the official version of events, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed him and was then sort of killed while in police custody by Jack Ruby. So obviously there are questions still hanging around that, particularly around Lee Harvey Oswald's background and these mysterious visits in Mexico City to the embassies of the then Soviet Union, and I believe to Cuba as well. So there are lots of things to be opened up there. I think that it is better to have more information rather than less, and I think that it is completely valid to say that the left used to be more skeptical of intelligence agencies, not only in relation to these assassinations, but in the whole history of the use of the COINTEL program, which was used to discredit more militant black groups in the 1960s and 70s and so forth.
Yeah, there was a lot of skepticism from the left about ICs until even just a few years ago, and one of the reasons that you actually saw a lot of independent journalists leaving The Intercept was because they felt even that outlet had been, to some extent, sort of captured by intelligence community sources. And it's been fascinating to watch this not quite right-left crossover, but almost a shifting of some left voices towards a more centrist position towards the now Republican view that that these institutions are not to be trusted.
Right, well, that's what I was going to say, because the shift has been murdered on the right as well, okay? Mm-hmm. Because, the right was traditionally the sort of pro-law and order, super patriotic approach, and that obviously has changed quite a lot in that people, particularly on the more I wouldn't
quite characterize it that way.
They were more pro-law and order.
Well, yes, but I would say that they still are that and patriotic, but the question is, does patriotism require you to blindly believe everything your government tells you? And I would view patriotism a different way, which is having pride in your country.
Oh, I agree with that.
And so I would say that it's more about a neoconservative.
Much more skeptical of that than the right was.
Sure, the left maybe was less jingoistic, but I would say that it's more about neoconservatism sort of fleeing the Republican Party than it is law and order and patriotism.
Well, I think that in terms of the overall view of society, conservatives tend to believe more in hierarchies and in authority, I would say, and I think that has shifted in the recent past in terms of being more skeptical of that where it pertains to the FBI and various other intelligence agencies. Now, to this point here, I do think it's worth saying on these cases that the fact that there is suspicion around them, we don't want to just throw them all in and say they are all the same. In RFK's case, for example, Sirhan was a Palestinian Jordanian man who appears to have killed Kennedy because he was hostile to Kennedy's support for Israel. And I have read and watched some of the theories around why he's not really guilty, and I haven't found them all that persuasive. So, we'll see what comes out, but I think that it is worth noting the differences in these various cases.
Yeah, well, we do know that Lee Harvey Oswald's last words were, "I'm a patsy," which is also what somebody who did it would say, but
sure.
But he could have been telling the truth.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it creates all sorts of suspicion around these facts. Like you, I think perhaps there will be. I worry that expectations are getting a little bit out of hand here, and that people think there's going to be I shouldn't use the term smoking gun in these circumstances because it's not the best metaphor, but there is going to be massively incriminating evidence. I'm not sure that that will be the case. I'm not sure that if every single document is released, it will put paid to public skepticism of the official accounts.
I would just think if the CIA was involved, which is sort of the popular prevailing theory.
In John F. Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. And MLK, I would say that they would have probably covered their tracks pretty significantly in the idea that they just filed all of the proof of their involvement away
and
to
hope
that a president never emerged.
Yeah.
What is interesting about Trump doing this now, though, is he talked about it in his first term, apparently saw the files and then decided not to do it, which has led some people to really get excited about what might be in there. Maybe even Trump was so horrified by the evidence he couldn't do it.
He took the advice of the intelligence community, at least to some extent, in what he chose not to release first time.
That's right.
Alrighty, the March for Life is happening in DC today, and we'll be talking about that up next. Stay with us. A woman's right to choose will be challenged today by the tens of thousands who will gather on the National Mall to voice their opposition to any form of abortion. Vice President J.D. Vance will be the headliner at the annual march, though President Donald Trump will reportedly deliver a remote address to the crowd. Trump's views on the issue are more complicated than people sometimes realize. In his first term, he named the justices who helped undo Roe v. Wade. But he has also favoured leaving the issue to the states from here on out, rather than backing a national abortion ban.
On Thursday, Trump pardoned around 23 pro-lifers who were thrown in prison over the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, or FACE Act.
Some of the crimes these protesters committed included forming blockades in front of abortion clinics. In one case out of Michigan, for instance, prosecutors argued that protesters conspired to prevent people from getting reproductive health services.
Here's Senator Josh Hawley on the floor this week discussing one of the imprisoned protesters.
Here's what she was doing when she was arrested. She was singing hymns in a clinic hallway from a wheelchair. That's right. She was arrested for singing hymns in a clinic hallway from a wheelchair. This concentration camp survivor, 89 years old, immigrant to this country, was put in prison, federal prison, by the last administration because she sang hymns from a wheelchair. Mr. President, I cannot begin to express, words do not capture the injustice of what this administration has done.
Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts wrote on X, "For 30 years, the FACE Act has been weaponized against people of faith who peacefully take a stand in defense of the unborn. It is an egregious violation of our rights and American values. My friend Chip Roy is spot on. It's past time to repeal the unjust FACE Act." Meanwhile, some on the right are now blasting John Fetterman for opposing the Born Alive Survivors Protection Act. The bill requires doctors and medical professionals to provide the same degree of care for a child born alive during an abortion as any other child.
Violators of the bill can face up to 5 years in prison and fines. Democrats say this bill is redundant since infanticide is already illegal. Fetterman wrote on X, "I've always stood on the side of Roe and a woman's right to make her own healthcare choices. It's absurd to mandate criminalization because of those choices. Any bill that does so, including the Born Alive Survivors Protection Act, is a no from me."
Conservative podcaster and commentator Michael Knowles wrote, "John Fetterman comes out swinging for denying medical care to infants screaming out for help on an operating table. Here's your centrist, reasonable Democrat, folks."
So I personally find the pardons issue more interesting than the Fetterman issue, because that just seems like basically it's making illegal something that is already illegal, as I understand it.
Not exactly. No, so basically how it works now, they claim that it's just double banning infanticide, but it's not exactly quite the same. So right now, when survivors of abortion are born alive, the doctors basically do not have a requirement to provide any medically necessary care to keep the baby alive. And there's been horrific stories about babies basically been put in closets to wait until they die so that the nurses don't have to hear the screams. There's an abortion survivor by the name of Melissa Oden, whose life was saved by a nurse who basically heard her crying after being born alive from an abortion and saved her life, and she miraculously survived without any complications. So what the law does is it requires doctors to, rather than be negligent in the care of these children who are born alive post-abortion, is it requires them to exercise the same degree of care that they would have if the baby were born under any other circumstance.
But wouldn't you be obligated to provide that care anyway, is my question?
Not after an abortion, because the intent of the abortion is to kill the child.
But if that fails, then the child is still alive. So
Right.
you can't, I don't understand how you can deny care to it.
That's the law as it stands right now.
Okay.
And that's what doctors don't have an obligation to provide care to the baby born alive because they've already tried to kill it essentially.
Okay. I mean, that
Yeah.
seems peculiar to me if that is truly
I agree.
the situation, but in any event. So the pardons that Trump has issued, I think we will obviously disagree on, and I think that these people were convicted of crimes that are clearly crimes under the statute. In some cases, there are two crimes. There is the FACE Act violation, and there is the conspiracy against rights. Now, these people are obviously, by the very nature of it, adamantly opposed to abortion and trying to prevent people from having abortions. And so the FACE Act says that it is a crime to, quote, by force or threat of force or by physical obstruction, to intimidate or interfere with anyone seeking or providing reproductive health services. Now, Josh Hawley, with all due respect to him, is being disingenuous in saying that people are being arrested for singing hymns. People are being arrested for blockading access to abortion clinics. I understand their moral argument. They believe that abortion's murder and they're preventing murder, but the law very obviously prevents people from doing that in a way that stops other people exercising their right as it then existed to an abortion. And I just want to mention one point, Amber, because I'm sure you'll have specific counters, but in one of these cases which pertain to Michigan, and I'm not sure if that's the one that Hawley's talking about where there's a woman in a wheelchair singing hymns, but prosecutors talked about the effects that had on people seeking abortions, one of whom was a woman identified only by her initials of SS, who had booked an appointment at this abortion clinic in 2020. She came with her husband. They had learnt that the fetus or embryo she was carrying had fatal abnormalities, and that continuing with the pregnancy, to carry the pregnancy to term, would have caused grave danger to her health and to her future fertility. And SS and her husband could not get in for this appointment that they had booked, which they had a legal right to. Now, I just think about someone in that degree of distress, having already to deal with that degree of trauma, trying to get around people who are physically blocking her from a right that she enjoys under the law. And I think that if we acknowledged her rights in the situation, we'd be a lot better off.
Well, I agree that people should not be blocking access to the clinics. That is against the law. They're not allowed to obstruct people's path or getting in the door to the clinic. But I've watched a lot of the videos of these individuals who were prosecuted and ultimately convicted and sentenced to multiple years, by the way. And a lot of them were not blocking access to the clinics. But because the FACE Act specifically says attempts to intimidate people who are going in, a dishonest prosecutor or DOJ can read that as if you're praying near the entrance, that could be seen as an attempt to intimidate someone who's going in to get an abortion.
Well, in the most high-profile name that I see mentioned in the reporting of these pardons, it's a woman by the name of Lauren Handy, and she and several others carried out a blockade of a clinic here in Washington, D.C., where she encouraged fellow protesters she had booked an appointment under a false name, for a start, because I assume she's on some kind of watch list as a very fervent anti-abortion activist. She then came in with fellow protesters, and they joined themselves together with locks and chains to block the doors of the clinic. This is in 2020, when obviously, it was legal to get Well, still is legal to get abortions in the District of Columbia. The point is, if you are chaining yourself together to block access to an abortion clinic, you are plainly infringing the FACE Act. It doesn't require any cynical or dishonest prosecutor.
No, in that case, you're actually 100% correct. That is blocking the access. I already said you're not supposed to do that. That's against the law. But the problem I have is that there are multiple videos that I've watched of people literally singing in the hallway, as Senator Hawley suggested. I watched them when they were first charged with these crimes, singing in the hallway, and they said, nope, you were intimidating people who were going to get abortions. And then on top of that, they added that other charge that you mentioned, which has increased their sentences basically tenfold. It's similar to what prosecutors did with January 6th by adding on that terrorism subcharge. Well, it's true.
Well,
and I would also close with the fact that the FACE Act is also supposed to protect people who are seeking religious services, right? It's supposed to go both ways, but yet under the Biden administration, they prosecuted these 22 pro-lifers, and yet there were hundreds of individuals who blocked access to Catholic masses and other church services in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade being overturned, and not a single one of those people faced prosecution under the FACE Act.
Well, if we get into the January the 6th parallels, Amber, we will literally be here all day. I have discussed it with our friend Mr. Suave several times this time. We're not going to come to a joint agreement on it. But in any event, good discussion. Up next, the salute that is reverberating around the globe. The so-called Nazi salute saga continues.
This week, podcaster Joe Rogan responded and had a message for those on the left who blasted Elon Musk for his awkward gesture during a recent speech. Here he is.
This is the Donald Trump excuse. You do anything you can to stop Hitler, you know, right? And this is why they want to conflate, and they always want to pretend that everyone's Hitler. The problem with that is it just, after a while, it's crying wolf, and people are like, oh, this is a game you're playing, and you're just using it as an excuse. Elon's talked about this a lot about, and he's absolutely correct, is that people use woke ideology as an excuse to be an and it's really just people that are attaching themselves to things that make them feel righteous. And so they wrap themselves in this idea to give them virtue and to allow them to say the most awful things about other people that have different perspectives. And then just by nature, if you're doing that, you're doing the wrong thing. You're a bad person. You can justify it all you want. You can find people that agree with you all you want. But those people also are on the right track, or the wrong track, rather. The people that are listening to you and agreeing with you, they're on the wrong track. They're the wrong track if we want to be collectively a kind, compassionate, cohesive society, a community of human beings that all live together.
Moreover, BMW UK made an announcement which many presumed was in response to this gesture by Elon Musk during a recent speech.
The company wrote on X on Wednesday, "We're no longer posting on X. Don't worry though, our customer support team is still here if you need us. You can also see all the latest BMW news by following us on Facebook and Instagram at BMW UK."
Republican Senator Mike Lee wrote on X, "BMW equals becoming more woke. Don't buy their cars."
You're not going to be buying that BMW you had your eye on now, Amber?
I wouldn't buy a BMW anyway. I heard the maintenance on them is terrible.
So look, I don't have much time for Joe Rogan's argument as it pertains to Elon. I think he's right in the broader sense. I think that, complaining about woke ideology is an argument that you can have about various things that could be considered excessive. I think that in Elon Musk's case, if you don't want to be accused of making a fascist-style salute, don't make a fascist-style salute then. I found that gesture ridiculous. I don't think it is implausible to argue that he was giving that kind of salute. It was such a weird gesture, and I don't know what is in his mind, nor do the people who defend him. But I think that there is a separation between what Elon Musk did, which looked for all the world like one of those kind of salutes, and a broader issue about wokeness or demonizing people with whom one disagrees.
I saw a video recently of Emmanuel Macron giving his heart out to the French people, and he did almost exactly the same gesture. I was actually shocked by how similar it was. But amazingly, when he did it, nobody accused him of being a Nazi. So I
Well,
guess
I've been more focused on the idea about various right-wing people on Twitter posting still photos of someone holding their arm out, and when you see the video, it is not remotely resembling the abrupt and aggressive gesture that Elon Musk.
Right, which is why I gave the Emmanuel Macron example, which I think you should watch the video. But I guess my follow-up for you would be, you say it's not implausible to think that Elon Musk would be giving a Nazi salute. What makes you say that?
Because I think he has exhibited a sympathy for far-right individuals and for far-right parties. I'm thinking specifically of his support for the AfD in Germany, and I think also in relation to Britain, we talked about this earlier in the week, he has supported, for example, one individual who was, in my view, quite rightly charged for inciting violence toward a particular mosque on social media, and I think that that is understandably and correctly a crime in the United Kingdom, and Elon Musk dislikes that. I also think during his proprietorship of X, it would certainly appear as if very right-wing voices that were previously removed from that platform have been put onto it. So I don't think it is, I think that the context of someone's behavior matters, and I think the behavior and views of someone like Elon Musk versus the views of someone like Kamala Harris or AOC are not comparable.
What do you think the line is between someone being right-wing or even far-right versus being engaging in Nazism?
I don't necessarily care what the line is. I think that the point is that the question was, why do I think Elon Musk might have done that? And my argument is, well, why do we not consider the context of his political views? And he has suggested that people are being unfair to him. He has never, to my knowledge, said he hasn't done it. That wasn't what he was doing. He has implied it by complaining about the criticism that he received.
Well, he did say on X that he was trying to give his heart to the crowd. So I think that's about as much of a rejection as you could ask for. But what I'm getting at with my question is that you must believe that there's some view that's held by people on what you're describing as the far right that makes it plausible that they could be engaging in Nazi symbolism. I'm trying to get at, like, what are those views?
I think that the views of the AfD are expressly anti-Islam and anti-immigrant. I think those are far-right views. I think that the raising up of people who are obviously on the far right in Britain by Elon Musk and the support for them, the belief, for example, that Nigel Farage, one of the most far-right figures in conventional politics in Britain, is somehow too soft, and that the Reform Party, which is Farage's party, should be overtaken by someone else. The question of is, I don't think Nigel Farage is a fascist, for example. I think Elon Musk clearly exhibits right-wing views that are going increasingly far-right. And I think that that gesture was a absurdly inflammatory gesture that, if you look at historical footage of those salutes, bears an extraordinary resemblance to.
See, the problem I get into here is that there's a significant portion of the American populace that believes in an immigration moratorium, who has legitimate questions about immigration from majority Muslim countries. And so when you say it's far right and you could be accused of being a Nazi if you make the wrong hand gesture, if you believe in those things, you're potentially smearing probably 30 to 40% of the American population, not to mention that the majority of people who voted for Donald Trump probably share very restrictionist immigration views as well.
Well, I mean, if you take his support for the AfD in Germany, for example, the Central Council of Jews in Germany called that party an extremist party that, quote, embodies Nazi ideals. Now,
I guess
in
I would ask for
November
specifics,
2023, when somebody talked about how Jewish communities have pushed, quote, hatred against whites, Elon Musk said, "You have said the actual truth." So the point is that he has a history of views that I personally consider noxious, but that I think are objectively views that belong to the far right. And therefore, that is why the gesture that he made is called into such question.
But there's a lot of people in modern political discourse who are well-respected members of the Republican Party who would say that there's discrimination against white people. And I don't know this.
Because of Jews? Would they say it's because of Jews?
No, I didn't catch that part. That obviously is not acceptable. But
Well, why did he say that the person had said the actual truth when they said that then?
can you read the quote again?
The quote was that someone had said that Jewish communities, quote, have pushed hatred against whites. And Elon Musk responded saying, you have said the actual truth.
I guess I want to see the full quote because I noticed that the quote mark didn't come until after Jewish communities, so I wonder if they're reading into that. I'd like to see the actual quote, but I don't know this organization. Is it similar to the SPLC, which...
No, this isn't an organization. The first quote that I read from the Central Council of Jews in Germany was an organization. The thing about Jewish people having pushed hatred against whites was something that occurred on X or on Twitter. I can't remember which it was.
I'm gonna find the full quote of that, but I find it not entirely convincing that group has accused Elon Musk of apparently espousing hatred against Jews, as the Anti-Defamation League has defended him and said that
it has. I think I understand that we're having quite a heated discussion, but I just want to be clear.
Sure.
The Central Council of Jews in Germany accuses the AfD, which Elon Musk supports, of being an extremist party that espouses Nazi ideals. There was a separate controversy when a person on X tweeted the quote that I
Elon Musk quote tweeted it,
and Musk tweeted it saying it's the actual.
Gotcha. I suppose I'm just skeptical of the characterization by groups that I'm not familiar with saying an accusation against a political party that I'm not familiar with, because I've seen how that happens to American political parties, and so I'm very cautious about that. I've seen how the SPLC has labeled friends of mine as far-right extremists or Nazis when it's not the case at all. So I want to look into the details of that myself before I make that determination. But I do think it is worthwhile, though, that the Anti-Defamation League says that they don't believe that Elon Musk was intending to make a Nazi gesture. Does that carry any weight for you at all?
If we get into a discussion of the ADL, we'll get into the whole Palestine question, because I don't think they have wrapped themselves in glory on that, to be very mild about it. They have, on occasion, cited the wearing of the Palestinian keffiyeh as equating to a wearing of the swastika, which I don't agree with.
I don't disagree with you on that, and that's what I think actually undergirds the point even more, which is the fact that they're so willing to call out anti-Semitism, even when it's not there, that the fact that they recoiled at people accusing Elon Musk of a Nazi gesture is what made me think this is the group most likely to go after this guy, and yet even they think that the criticism is a bridge too far.
Yeah, I think people on the left would say that the ADL has been sort of cozying up to Trump and Trump world, but I think we may have to leave. Maybe we can get back to this subject some other time. That's a good discussion. Up next, more strong words, this time from James Carville for the former president, Mr. Biden. Stick with us.
Veteran Democratic strategist James Carville tore into former President Joe Biden Thursday. Let's watch what he told his co-host Al Hunt on the Political War Room.
This entire thing, in this kind of petty back and forth, I would have beat Trump. No one fucking believes that at all. Guy, you had a noble career. Your last act was terrible. Just get out of the way. The party's moving on. I mean, they're really moving on. And it's very sad but that's just where we are. And he created this himself. He has nobody to blame but himself. Nobody. No one wants to hear from this guy anymore. Okay? Right. Just go to your condo in Rehoboth and stay there.
Looking ahead, Carville zeroed in on what he wants to see from the party. Let's watch that.
When somebody runs for Democratic nomination in 2028, the first thing that I want to hear out of their mouth is, I'm taking our message everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. I mean Joe Rogan, I mean Fox News, I mean Sunday morning shows, I mean everything. We're dour, okay? It's always somebody's in a pissy mood, or somebody's this. And we're just not connecting. We're not connecting at all. And then we strategically don't go on places that accentuate certain parts of popular culture, particularly male popular culture. And the result is just the same thing.
Well, our old friend James Carville, who joined us on Rising a fairly short time ago, making his feelings known quite candidly, as he tends to do. So look, I have been rather critical of now former President Biden on here. I think he did hang around too long. I think that it was a grave political miscalculation to do so. I'm not sure, I mean, when James talks about or insists that Biden has to get out of the way, I guess my only question is he really in the way? I mean, Joe Biden is the age he is. He has left the scene. He's maybe talking about those reports that Biden is kind of cheesed off about the idea that he could have beaten Trump and Kamala Harris did not. If Biden believes that, I think it's a fanciful belief. But I'm just not sure he's in the way in any sense. And so that's my only caveat on James's complaints there.
So I kind of connect this to the New Yorker profile on Kamala Harris's sort of post-election plans and whether she's going to go quietly in the night and live happily in California ever after, or if she might run for governor, or if she might end up running for president again in 2028. And it kind of got at this idea that it would be incredibly difficult for her to run for president even in 2028 because she still carries the baggage of the Biden administration. So to me, Carville's almost hinting more at a problem for the Democratic Party than Joe Biden himself, which is that they have to put up a candidate in 2028 that is divorced from the hugely unpopular Biden admin.
Well, that is an argument that you can make. It would be, I think, uncharacteristic of Carville if he said Biden when he wouldn't normally be somebody who would be reticent about criticizing people. And I would assume that if he has problems with Kamala Harris, he will say so. I have a lot of sympathy with his general critique, I suppose. The idea that Democrats have not taken their message to some of those places that they might have done so. As we know, Kamala Harris, when she was a candidate, did not make the Joe Rogan interview happen. Trump did. He sat there for, I think it was a 3-hour interview, if I remember correctly, and it quickly racked up millions and millions of views. I also think that Carville's point seems to be about Democrats not connecting with a sense of sort of anger or resentment in the country about various economic issues and malaise and wage stagnation and all of that. I again have a lot of sympathy with that view. I think it's something that Democrats are going to need to do a lot better in the years ahead. And although I expect there will be many things almost every day from Mr. Trump's desk that Democrats object to vigorously and sincerely, I'm not sure that will be enough to win back Congress in 2 years or the White House in 4 years.
Yeah, I think the midterms are a better shot for them than the 2028 White House, but we'll see what happens with that. The RNC better get their game together and start getting ready because the conditions always after a new president is elected are quite bad for the incumbent party.
Right. Who do you think, as someone who has more insight or more feel for the conservative movement than I do, assuming that Trump is going to in fact leave, and I know there's always Democratic fears that he'll actually just go on, but assuming he's not the Republican nominee in 2028, who do you think would be among the front runners?
Vance, easily.
You think it would be Vance way out ahead?
He's the most ideologically simpatico with the Trump agenda and MAGA and America First policy. He's one of the most populist members of the Republican Party, which is where the party is moving. You see neoconservatives, for example, sort of fleeing the party, and even people who wouldn't traditionally be considered MAGA feeling like they have to get on board because Trump is so popular within the party's base. So I think Vance is the obvious successor. He's obviously an incredibly smart guy. He's also young. He is able to do media interviews very, very well. He's great on policy. So it seems very obvious to me. Josh Hawley is actually probably the second closest ideologically to J.D. Vance, who sort of has like the intellectual view of MAGA. But Josh Hawley is very, very wonky and I think better suited for the Senate.
So I think among Democrats, and I say this partly to annoy Robbie since he shares a home state with this person, I think Gretchen Whitmer might end up as the Democratic nominee. I think that she has a capacity to connect with people. I think she's not so easily dismissed as some like Gavin Newsom types are, as the quote unquote coastal elites. I think she's a very talented politician, and I think she is capable of, to get back to Carville's point, I think she does have the capacity to act as a sort of a vehicle for that criticism or resentment of economic lack of progress. She basically, I think, could unite the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party and the more centrist parts of the Democratic Party. So maybe we'll hang around here talking for 4 years and we'll get a Gretchen Whitmer versus J.D. Vance election.
Maybe so. That would be very interesting. I'm curious about how she'll play outside of Michigan, because that is a very unique political state.
It is.
And I'm wondering if she can sort of expand that coalition to some of the other swing states.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it is going to be interesting because it is, assuming that Trump is indeed term limited out, it's going to be one of those interesting elections where there's no, it's an open seat for the nomination on either side.
Indeed. Coming up, Trump is not done with his national security purge yet. We'll tell you all about it next on Rising. President Donald Trump is showing no signs of slowing down, revoking security protection for his former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former top aide Brian Hooke.
Sources told the New York Times that both Pompeo and Hooke face threats from Iran. They were part of the team under President Trump 1.0 that ordered a drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, a powerful Iranian general.
Here's what Trump had to say Thursday about the move.
Sir, why did you revoke security protections for former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Brian Hooke?
Well, the same reason I did. When you have protection, you can't have it for the rest of your life. Do you want to have a large detail of people guarding people for the rest of their lives? I mean, there's risks to everything.
Fox News contributor and town hall editor Guy Benson wrote on X, Iran is trying to kill Pompeo in retaliation for the good and correct killing of Soleimani, as rightly ordered to Trump. As long as the threat is active, he and other officials should be protected.
On the other end, journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo are two of the most deranged and bloodthirsty warmongers this side of Liz Cheney, and I'm finding it genuinely entertaining watching people upset that Trump decided they don't deserve lifelong, government-paid, around-the-clock security details.
Trump's National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, sent about 160 National Security Council aides home this week.
Waltz's chief of staff told the aides to be on call. They will only return if their supervisors ask them to.
NSC spokesman Brian Hughes said the move was to ensure personnel are committed to implementing Trump's America First agenda. Well, where do you want to start with this, Amber? The revocation of the detail for Pompeo and
Let's do
the
it.
NSC stuff. Okay, so I have no great sympathy for Mike Pompeo, and I don't really disagree with Glenn Greenwald's assessment of the overall policy. Where I have some sympathy is the idea, it's very unusual for me to agree with Guy Benson too, I might add, but Benson's argument is one that I do actually have quite a lot of sympathy with, which is if someone in a fairly senior level of government is involved in an action that is part of their official duties that the President of the United States at the time has supported or decided to go for, and that action results in a credible threat being made against them, it seems to me that there kind of is a moral obligation on the government of the United States to protect them from a threat that has been incurred in the performance of their duties.
That part is the only element of the argument that I'm sympathetic to, is that this threat exists because of his things that he carried out during his course of duty in serving the country. But I think that similar threat exists for plenty of other former government officials who don't have access to secret security protection for their entire life or until that threat is gone. I mean, even if you just think of members of our military, right? They don't get taxpayer-funded Secret Service protection, and yet they're probably on all kinds of hit lists from various countries that they've served in.
I wonder, is that true? I mean, it is certainly true that countries that they've served in would have a grievance against the US military. But I would actually like to know how common it is for individual, as it were, rank and file members of the military to be under specific death threats. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth asking. But I also find it interesting that it is a lot of Democrats who are taking issue with this, because there was indeed a refusal from the Biden administration in particular to grant RFK Jr. Secret Service protection when he was running for president. And then you also had, I believe it was Benny Thompson, who actually filed a piece of legislation that would have limited the amount of Secret Service that Trump was able to have access to on the campaign trail. And this is a guy who ended up facing 2 assassination attempts. So it seems like there's a little bit of a double standard here from some Democrats who would like to criticize one example of pulling security, but not their own.
It is a curious thing, the whole issue of Secret Service protection, because we all carry our sort of personal experiences into our perceptions of things. And having grown up in a place where there was in fact a political conflict, I am frequently surprised at the comparative lack of Secret Service protection that I see for very well-known people just as I walk around Washington. Now, there is obviously a related issue about the Secret Service, less in terms of funding per se, but in terms of resources, in terms of the people who have gone through the amount of training required to provide protection to politicians or other people in the public eye who are under real threat. I mean, clearly in the case of Trump, that those were legitimate and serious, and in one case very close to a successful assassination attempt against him. And obviously there were very serious questions, to say the very least, about the Butler attempt and how the guy got on the rooftop, and it seemed just even to people who are not experts in security inexplicable how that happened. Obviously, I don't think that decisions about who gets protection should be made on whether we like their politics or not. If they are public officials within the small d democratic process and they're in danger, I think they should be protected. I understand that resources are finite, but there we are.
One of the other points that Glenn Greenwald brought up was that Mike Pompeo and some of these other individuals who have had their security taken away got extraordinarily wealthy from their positions serving the U.S. government. So perhaps there's a calculation that should be made as well as to whether or not someone can afford private security. And if you're someone who has not, traded your security clearance for getting major media gigs or doing speeches or working in the military-industrial complex, maybe then you do deserve some taxpayer help on that front.
Yeah, and we've addressed actually that point or a related point a couple of times this week on Rising, which is this idea that people get lifelong security clearances. So even when you're retired from government service, you hang on to your security clearance. That seems just on its face pretty shady to me.
Agreed.
And pretty unnecessary. And I assume that people leverage it all the time for private employment opportunities, shall we say, which are often quite lucrative, and that doesn't seem quite right. Did
you want to take us to the other topic we were supposed to cover? I don't have my full script here, so I'll leave it to you.
Yes, now you've... Oh, people being told to go home.
That's right. National Security Council. That's right.
National Security Council have been told to go home because they're not America first enough. There is obviously skepticism in Trump world that the first time around they were undercut by people who were much more part of the Republican establishment. Beyond political views, I think that a president has the right more or less to choose who he or she, when we get to that stage, wishes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, if you're someone who is, let's say, a career as opposed to a political appointee in an administration, you still have an obligation to carry out the duties that you're given by the executive as a member of that branch, and that should be the only consideration that's taken into account when determining whether or not one of those people gets to stay in and continue to work for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is not very democratic to have someone elected to the presidency who is trying to enact their policies and then experiencing resistance from within. That seems to be empowering people who are not elected to do too much.
With therefore no accountability through the electoral process. Indeed. All right, great show today. That's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you next time.